Energy Disruptors. Please welcome to the stage Deborah Yedlin of the Calgary Herald and Sean Gourley, founder and CEO, Primer.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here and have a chance to put Sean on the hot seat and tell us about his journey that straddles Silicon Valley and the energy sector. So Sean, I've just finished covering a bunch of annual meetings, and at every annual meeting I looked around to see who's on the board and what they look like in terms of their demographic, and whether there's anybody at the boardroom table who has something resembling tech experience. And I've been very disappointed for the last several years because I don't see that presence at the boardroom table, but you are on the board of Anadarko, and you were selected to be a director at the age of 35. How did that come about, and how's that working for you? You have a PhD in physics. You're not the usual guy that sits around a boardroom table of an energy company.
Yeah, it was kind of strange. So I got a call initially from Doug McMillan, who is the CEO of Walmart. And I'd gotten to know Doug over the years with deploying some AI technology into Walmart. And he said to me, there's an opportunity, I'm not sure if you'd be interested, with a company called Anadarko, but you should talk to the CEO. And I didn't know who Anadarko was my first kind of response.
But you use energy every day, right?
That's exactly right. So it was this kind of like blind spot that I had in the kind of the global energy sector. And I had no idea who this $40 billion company was. So I took a call with Al Walker, the CEO of Anadarko, and we sort of talked through what he was looking for. And then sort of the statement was like, you know, look, technology is a big part of what we do, and there's no real technologists on the board. And we sort of likened it to this idea of, at some point it became, you know, essential that you had someone with accounting experience on a company board. And, you know, we're sort of saying, look, at some point in a company board, you're going to need someone with technology expertise. And so we went through that process, and I got to know them, and then ended up, you know, accepting, you know, the offer that they put together. And now I'm sitting on the board. I've been there for 2.5 years. And
what have you learned? What has surprised you? And what are you trying to change at Anadarko so that they become more competitive across the board?
The first thing that sort of surprised me, I think, coming through there, I remember asking about their R&D capabilities. And I remember one of the answers that came back to me was we don't, you know, really do that. We're a mid-sized player. You know, that's for the big players. And I sort of looked at that and I was like, you're a $40 billion company. You know, you're massive, right? This doesn't make any sense where I come from. You know, in my world, you know, you're a 5-person company. You have technology at the heart of what you do. And so that was probably the biggest surprise, was this sort of collective outsourcing of technology inside of the oil and gas sector. And that didn't make any sense to me because, you know, ultimately, where's your competitive advantage if you don't bring that in-house?
Because a lot of people say, well, why do we need that? We'll just outsource it and we'll have consultants. But you're saying that's critical to your competitive advantage. So what kind of changes have you been able to sort of put forward from the boardroom table through the CEO that have changed the way Anadarko operates?
I think the first thing that...
Or is it still a work in progress?
Well, so the first year was me getting up to speed. Like, there was a lot of kind of legwork, a lot of jargon, a lot of acronyms that I had to get my head around and understand. But coming through that, one of the core pieces of this puzzle was to sit down and put together an advanced research group that would not just do science, but would actually build prototypes and really make use of machine learning and neural networks to start understanding the data that they had. And so that's now about 1.5 years old. It's called the 8. And that's, you know, I think about 120 people now working in that group, and some really, really exciting breakthroughs that have come through out of that. It's early days yet, but I would sort of liken this to being an industry that is you know, huge amount of data, huge amount of talent, but just relatively primitive when it comes to taking that data and doing things with it.
So one of the things we talk about a lot, especially in the last decade, is how technology heavy the energy sector has become. But you're saying there's a difference between the technology that the energy sector says it's employing versus what you bring to the table and what your company Prime could actually help companies resolve in terms of challenges.
Yeah, it's funny, right? One of the, the things on this was how separate Silicon Valley and Houston were. And it was almost like just two major industries that didn't talk. And like, that goes both ways, right? Like, the people in Silicon Valley would probably have no real idea about where oil actually comes from and how important it is as a component of the global energy system. But at the same time, Houston had very little idea about what was going on in Silicon Valley. So it was like these two things that no one talks to. And so I don't know, I'm sort of the first bridge.
No kidding. And I'm wondering if you're sort of seen as a bit of a traitor because you're from Silicon Valley and you're in this new world of technology, and yet you're on the board of a company that's an old industrial energy company that's being painted as being not very responsible from an environmental standpoint. So you're sort of playing two sides of one coin. How does that work when you're in California, and how does it work when you're in Houston?
Yeah, it's funny. Everyone in Houston has always said to me, Sean, how do you go back to California and justify what you do here? And it's interesting, right? Because you sort of sit in the middle of this dynamic, right, where the majority of the energy we produce and consume in the world is oil and gas, right? But at the same time, you've got this incredible technological advancement in material science and energy storage capacity that is emerging from places like Silicon Valley. So one of the things on this is it's not an either-or situation, right? You can't bet today everything on photovoltaics because, frankly, they're not going to be there yet. So if you want to shut off global energy and switch to photovoltaics, we've got to cut 98% of our energy consumption, which means life as we know it stops, right? So that's not an option. But at the same time, it's convincing the people in Houston, it's like, well, this is not going to be around forever, right? Like, this is not going to last forever, because if we keep burning fossil fuels at this rate, the planet as we know it in 30 years may not look like something we want to live in.
So one of the things I was curious about, too, is that we talk about risk-taking in the energy sector. And companies are comfortable saying, well, you know what, we are going to drill this well, it's going to cost tens of millions of dollars, and we're prepared to risk that money. But when it comes to really risking money on technology and implementing something different, you're finding, I'm guessing, a different mindset. Can you talk about that in terms of how you try and bridge that gap and help them to understand why it's important?
Yeah, so the oil and gas space is incredibly comfortable with big risks. I mean, so at Anadarko we're operating out of Algeria, and there's risks there every day geopolitically. We're exploring off the coast of Colombia, and you drill holes there, and you can knock $100 million on something that ends up being zero. And at the same time, the rewards, as we saw with our LNG discoveries in Mozambique, are just massive. And so there's this very, very binary kind of outcome. And so I think the industry works very, very well with risk when it's comfortable and familiar with the space. But when you go into the technology space, there's no sort of comfort or familiarity. And so the whole propensity for risk kind of diminishes and says, we don't want to do that because we don't know it. Let someone else take care of it, and whatever they come up with, we'll use.
The first to be the second adopter of something new. What kinds of conversations are you having to change that mindset? Because you're bringing both sides of the, you have the capacity to bridge that gap. And so I'm wondering if you're proceeding along a road where people are actually understanding it's okay to risk the $100 million on the well, and you know what, we can risk a little bit of money on technology, even though we don't know what that outcome is. Is it resonating, or is it still? Do you feel like you're talking to a wall?
The nice thing of being in a very capex-heavy industry is that people are very cheap comparatively, and so in Silicon Valley, most of it's OpEx. It's your people, it's your engineers, it's your staff, and when you go to them and say, well, you can legitimately build out a 100-person AI machine learning team, and it might cost you $20-25 million to run that. I mean, that's nothing in the scheme of like running. It's not even a drill, right? And so once you get them around that thing, you start to say, there's huge upside with data and machine learning. That's actually relatively cheap as a fraction of your total spend. And I think once that bridge was crossed, it suddenly became sort of play money, right? It's like, wow, we can make these bets, the upside's huge, and it's really not costing us a lot of capital.
So the energy sector generates so much data, and there's a challenge in terms of how that data is captured, synthesized, analyzed, and put to use. Where do you think the opportunities are? your company Prime, is that part of what you can help the energy sector address some of those data capturing challenges and the benefits that come with it?
Yeah, so look, one of the, I think, statistics coming out now is we're looking at a pipeline, right? So 100,000 kilometers.
Not Trans Mountain.
Yeah, that's right. If you look at a pipeline, there's about 150 terabytes of information coming off every 100,000 kilometers of a pipeline. You know, the oil industry is probably one of the biggest producers of data in the world. If you take a shot of 3D seismic imaging, huge files that are kind of recorded. But then what tends to happen on that is people sit down on top of this huge amount of data and kind of wade their way through it in a very methodical but very slow human process. And so when you look at this, I would say we've done a very good job collecting data, and we're doing better jobs as we put more devices that record information. But collectively, we've done a very bad job of making use of that data. So that looks like a huge kind of opportunity, and right? So as we look at this, I think there's going to be a few jumps that come through. And I think the ones that I'm sort of most excited about, I think the statistical analysis that we can do on the unconventional drilling spaces in the US is going to be huge. Like, we just haven't even scratched the surface on that. And I think there's probably another 20 or 30% of cost reductions that we can get just by making better use of that data. The second bit is these offshore 3D seismic images. You know, things that would take months to kind of analyze can be done in days, right? And they can be done in days by automating the processes that are there. And that means you can shoot a lot more information and you can get much higher fidelity about what's going on. So as you look through all of this, I think the opportunity is massive, and it's all about taking the tools that we've been developing out in the Valley and applying them to the oil and gas space.
So do we have the talent that's needed to analyze that data and really understand what it's telling us?
Yeah, so this is kind of one of the challenges, right? And I would say inside of the industry, no, right? And so one of the big jumps for people is to go outside of the industry, right? And to start saying we need to kind of bring in people and get them educated about oil and gas, but we need to take the skills that they've brought and developed in other industries and other sectors. So it's been interesting going through that process now, and most of the team that's been built in Anadarko is actually from outside on the machine learning side of things. And it's been interesting. So
where have they come from?
Well, actually, so it's interesting. So a lot of them actually coming locally from people that are just graduating with degrees in artificial intelligence, machine learning. There's some people that are making the journey across from New York and from San Francisco. But you know, for a lot of it is actually people that are just graduating and coming with the right tools into the space.
So one of the other gaps that we see, in addition to not seeing people of your demographic around a board, is that we don't see the young sort of expertise, the creative thinking, sitting in the executive leadership teams at the within the energy companies. How do we get somebody like you sitting in the executive leadership team so that we can actually harness the potential of what you know, the way you think, and the way you problem solve that actually benefits the company and sets a tone for the company as a whole? Because it's one thing to come from the bottom, but it's another thing when it sits at the top and you can really see what's going on. How do we clone you?
Yeah, look, I think before they sort of start to sit down and try and clone me, I think a lot of people are going to be watching, right? Like, there's definitely a lot of folks watching and saying, who is this person, Sean? You know, what is he doing? What's it going to result in? You know, if I fall on my face on this, then I think there might not be a lot more of me, right? But if we're successful in some of this stuff, I think a lot of people are going to go out and say, where do I find, you know, the 35-year-old person with the background in technology that I can bring into the space? Because you know what? Some of the decisions that are being made around the board, you know, they hinge on these technological bets. And if you don't have a dexterity in that space, well, do you trust your board to kind of like, you know, provide the right governance on top of it? I think the second bit is it acts as a huge kind of stamp of approval for any of these new ventures that are happening inside of the company, right? And so you immediately feel like you've got top-level cover. And so when I go down to the advanced teams working on machine learning, they feel like the company is supporting them, right? And that I think, as much as anything, is the value of this. It says, you know, look, we value this enough to put it at the highest level of governance.
What about the difference between a CIO and a CTO? How important is that distinction? Where do you see that fitting into the structure of the new evolving energy company, so to speak?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Most of the organizations will run a CIO that may report up certainly to the executive board level. But it's interesting. So as a CIO, your job is kind of to make sure the systems run. Your job is to make sure everything is kind of like going as it should be. Which is quite different and distinct from a CTO, whose job it is to go out and try and make some bets on technology that could have 100x upside, Now, most of them will fail, and so you go into that with a very risk-orientated mindset. And if you kind of confuse those two roles, you don't want someone taking risks on the data that you've got or on the safety or on the operational side of the information systems. But you absolutely want someone taking those kinds of risks on some of the technological bets that aren't necessarily mission critical today, but could be in the future. So I think those roles have to kind of diverge, right? I don't see a CIO having the CTO necessarily reporting under them. You actually have two different roles.
Yeah. Where do you see the sort of the need from a skills development perspective? I mean, you have a lot of people that have come through engineering. They understand math. This is all about math, right? So how do you sort of make sure that people can pivot and sort of augment their educational background so that they can contribute in a different way, in a more creative way, and a more value-added way, compared to where they were, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago?
So it's interesting as you look at automation, particularly with machine learning coming through. A lot of the geophysicist tasks are at the first stages of being automated, right? And if you run this forward, I think with the improvements we're seeing, you could see about 80–90% of some of those workflows purely automated by machines.
Then what?
Well, then I think you've got a hugely talented group of people that you need to say, well, how do we get you to do things that are particularly taking advantage of the human intelligence, right? And I think that's where you sort of look at this. I think it's not necessarily about removing people from the workflow, but actually taking bits of it that are quite mechanical and freeing them up to be a little bit more creative, right? And I think that's where you start to kind of look at the changing landscape of what machine learning is going to do for the industry.
So let's talk about the distinction between machine learning, artificial intelligence, and I think what you're talking about in the geophysics example is augmented intelligence. Can we just sort of break that down in terms of what the three different pieces look like, and then maybe we can talk about neural networks?
So look, I think machine learning, I sort of have this debate when people talk about artificial intelligence, and I say, you mean machine learning? And they say, no, I mean artificial intelligence. I say, well, describe to me an artificial intelligence that doesn't have machine learning, or that has something more than machine learning. And then you sort of pause for a moment, and there's not a lot else there. Now, you can argue that a set of if statements and or statements, which are there, but it's not a very advanced artificial intelligence. So if we think about AI and ML, they're kind of one and the same. It just so happens that when you package up machine learning into a set of into a sort of set of behaviors that start to replicate human behavior, we start to call that AI, right? So that's very much concerned with the automation of human cognitive tasks. And on the other side of this is, well, what happens to the human when the tasks are automated? And I think the interesting thing there is that machine intelligence and human intelligence are actually quite different. Well, what's interesting about machine intelligence is that it's not the same as human intelligence. It can do things that we can't do, and we can do things that it can't do. And so there's an orthogonality between the two of them. And of course, when you have that, it gives an opportunity to say, well, how do we take the best of machine intelligence and the best of human intelligence and bring them together in a way that creates a more intelligent system than anything else?
So what's the thing that we need to really understand? And so when you talk, a lot of people are sort of throwing around those terms very loosely. And there is also a sense that it's just such a big concept. How do we help the energy sector understand that you can start implementing these changes and you don't have to be a $40 billion company? Where do you start to have the biggest impact? And you start, what's the first step?
Yeah, so it was interesting coming through the first few board meetings was really saying is, look, don't even think about AI, machine learning. Just think about good old-fashioned statistics and regressions. And like, you've got the data. I guarantee if you look at it, if you do some basic statistical analysis, you're going to get somewhere between 5 and 15% gains in performance improvements. It's not complex, but you've got to put your mindset onto that. And so that was kind of the starting place. And sure enough, it was true. It was like you start looking at that and you start looking at the data and it reveals inefficiencies. So the first kind of gain of this stuff is really inefficiencies, right? Removing those. The second one is you go in and you start automating chunks of workflow. And you say, take the people out of that, free them up to do other things and automate that. The third flow is when you build these loops and these systems. And that's where we're going to start getting to, is you say, well, we can now autonomously drill a horizontal well. We can take the microseismicity back. We can feed that back in and change it through to kind of change the fluid dynamics as they're injected. And we can do all that automatically. Well, now you've got thousands of those things running automatically. The cost is reduced massively, and so maybe your risk profile for putting one in has changed too. So as you go through the kind of the phases, It's like start one is kind of like efficiency. Step two is automation, and step three is building systems that enable things that would otherwise never have been done.
And what you're telling me is that it all goes back to math.
It goes back to math. It goes back to knowing the opportunities for the business, and it also goes back to knowing the capabilities of humans, right? And ultimately, you're trying to assemble together what's best for the business, what's best for the human kind of intelligence, and what's best for machine intelligence.
So what kinds of, when you talk about humans, we talk about talent. What kind of talent should we be developing that can harness the potential of what lies ahead and implement it so that, there's benefit to society and to company?
So it's interesting. So looking out at this, there's a whole kind of world of geophysicists, which you would sort of call, I liken it to the fundamentalists in the financial markets. And the fundamentalists used to go down and analyze every component of a company, right? You sit down and look at the EBITDA, you look at the kind of the executives, you look at the reporting structures, and you'd build up a kind of a model of how the company was performing. We're very, very similar, right, with geophysicists. You build up this incredibly complex model of the rock structures that you're dealing with. Now, what happened in the financial space was the quants came in, and it didn't really matter too much, the fundamentals, because you could start to do statistical models that would actually outperform all of that. And we're seeing that as you move from offshore on the conventional plays to the onshore unconventional. And you have thousands of wells and huge amounts of data coming through. And all of a sudden, like the complexity of analyzing the geophysics of a rock fracture is incredibly difficult and not necessarily amenable to the kinds of models that we've seen before. So it lends itself massively to this statistical approach. And I think what we're going to see in this industry as we move to the onshore unconventional is the same kind of transition that we saw from fundamental to quant in the financial markets.
And how does that manifest itself within companies? That's a quantum shift. And how does that manifest, and what's the impact?
There's a lot more numbers and equations that start to kind of bubble up and become important. I think you start to also have to redesign working environments that are more amenable to that. So you need spaces that are much more collaborative, spaces that involve a lot more whiteboards and open rooms. It starts to look a lot more like the world.
Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley. So we had to go through and knock out a couple of floors of the tower in Houston and say, this is just not going to work in the cubicles.
And what happened?
Everyone wants to move down there now. It's a much nicer space to work. But it was.
Because for the longest time there has been such a siloed environment, right? So if the workspaces are just as much a part of it as it is the knowledge space, it's interesting that you have to change that as well.
Yeah, because if your job is to kind of like make sure you've got a good relationship with Schlumberger, you get on the call, you go and play some golf, you make sure you're getting the right price, and you outsource it. Right. But you bring it in, all of a sudden, like, your job involves interacting with everyone around you in your organization, and you have to come up with something that no one's solved before. Right? It's a really different work dynamic, which needs a different work environment.
So I'm curious as to whether Anadarko's relationship with its service providers has changed because of what it's been doing internally from the data side in terms of how it's capturing data and using it. Has that changed, made it better, worse, different?
It's interesting. So I spoke at the Halliburton data event in Houston last year, and I think they actually kind of like embraced that a lot, because at some point you're actually going out and saying, look, data is important, and what you do with it is very important. Now, on the flip side of that, we're coming in and taking things that we traditionally would have outsourced and saying we're going to do it ourselves because we believe we can do it better. So we're not going to get rid of that relationship totally, but some things that we view as being core assets to us, we're going to take in and take on and do. The second thing is, instead of waiting for the Halliburtons and Schlumbergers to go and acquire the emerging technology companies, we're sitting down and saying what we do in Silicon Valley is like, let's have that relationship with them today. If we want to kind of buy a stake in them or purchase the company, we should have that, right? Because we're going to get it at a better price and earlier than if we buy it as a service after Schlumberger's bought them. So this dynamic is much more how we are in the Valley. And I think there's an adoption now that people are looking at and saying, look, there's some good things about being this way out in Houston.
Well, it used to be that so many of the big players would have their in-house research facilities and their labs, and now it's almost as if they're trying to go back there, but in a different way and using a different kind of a platform.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? So most of the stuff here that was done was kind of an internal R&D science team. So you go and you publish your paper and you present it to the American Geophysical Society, and you get a gold stamp if you publish your paper. But it's very, very different from building prototypes that can be deployed into the field and can be used by people in the organization. And so whilst it's still R&D, I treat it much more like prototyping rather than science. Science has a horizon of 7 to 10 years. Prototyping has a horizon of 12 to 18 months, right? And that's the stuff that you can bring in and get a competitive advantage with today. So it's a very, very different mindset. So I think that's been the transition we see as in-house research labs become in-house prototyping facilities.
So I was at CERAWeek this year in Houston, and one of the things everybody kept saying was the energy sector is being Watsoned, and they kept on talking about IBM and its Watson platform. And I'm curious as to how you look at that, that comment. It was rolling off everybody's tongue very quickly. I'm sure if anybody is here from IBM, they'd be happy to hear that. But
I'll be diplomatic on this. Watson's done a wonderful job marketing its abilities.
So tell me about your company and what the trick of a journalist is to ask an open-ended question. So tell us about Prime and what you're doing and how it competes with Watson.
Yeah, so look, with us, I would say if you're going to deal in artificial intelligence, we specialize in natural language processing, natural language understanding, natural language generation. And this is an incredibly difficult game. You are trying to build machines that can read and write, right? So this is kind of a step up from recognizing cats and dogs and images, right? So it's more complex than image recognition. So very, very difficult task to do well, but actually it's a relatively easy task to do somewhat well, right? And so what does that mean? It means you start getting into these measures of success, which is precision and recall, and they can be combined together into an F-score. So whenever you start talking about this stuff, you can say, I'm doing AI, where you start saying, well, what algorithms are you using? What's their precision? What's their recall? What are their failure modes? What data are they being trained on? What are the biases that exist inside of that? You know, and so you start to kind of dig into that kind of piece of it. So for us, it's very much a technical process, and our team is 90% engineers. So as we're working on that, we're going to maintain that structure because there's a lot of deep technical problems to solve. If you look at that, you know, versus an IBM, the traditional kind of tech team that they'll be working with will be maybe half project managers, maybe a third sales, and then you probably outsourced your engineering component to maybe somewhere in Eastern Europe.
So what you're saying is you've got a better sort of focus on the problem at hand in terms of solving the challenges of the company.
So to do the kinds of things that Watson is advertising, it's possible, but it's 5 years out, right? So there's a lot of technical breakthroughs that need to happen between now and then. And you're not going to do that with sales, marketing, and project management, right? You're going to do that with engineers solving difficult problems and measuring their progress as they step through it.
So one last question. You know, we're at a conference. We're talking about energy disruption. You're sitting at the board of Anadarko, and you're seeing how you've had a chance to sit at the, witness 3 years of change, dramatic change in the industry. You've seen some disruption. What do you see as the next big hurdle and the next big step change in the energy sector from your perspective, given your background and your knowledge of the tech sector and the whole world of physics?
So there's a few things that I'm excited about when I look at energy. And one of the nice things about being 30-something on a board is you can look at a 30-year horizon, which is kind of cool. So
term limits might not be a bad idea, but we'll leave that for governance.
Well, at least get 10 years on it, right? Yeah. But the point is that it affords a long-term horizon, right? And it's not clear in 30 years' time that oil and gas will be the dominant form of energy in the world.
Well, the IEA might debate that with you.
So the IEA has been consistent in its predictions of the amount of fossil fuels being used, but it's been about 50% under in all the other energy forms that it's been predicting. So the IEA does a very, very good job of oil and gas and coal, and a terrible job of almost everything else in its predictions and projections. So we can kind of go through that. But if we do continue to use it, I'm not sure we've got a planet that we want to live in, right? So maybe it's economically feasible, but it's maybe not environmentally feasible. So as I look at that dynamic, you're going to see change regardless, right? And we've already seen change in the last 10 years with fracking, right? There's been one of the biggest kind of technological inventions that have changed the entire geopolitical scope of energy in the world, right? So we're already living through perhaps one of the biggest energy changes in our lifetime, and it's come not from photovoltaics, but it's come from fracturing. So as I look at this, I think a few things become very exciting for me. I think one is we can probably get the cost down to half of what it is with fracturing. So I think there's just so much low-hanging fruit and so much that can be done with data and automation and that process. We're not even scratching the surface. I think the second bit that gets really exciting is, as we look 10 years out, you can see drones of autonomous ships continually doing 3D seismic imaging all around the planet, interpreting those with neural networks to determine what's going on, to get a really, really good idea, high fidelity, of where the oil reserves actually are. So that's going to kind of create a downward cost structure of both conventional and unconventional.
Decreases risk too, right? Yeah.
Massively decreases risk. But then when you go from that, I think you start looking and saying, well, you're very, very good at deploying autonomous fleets of vehicles to map the subsurface environment, and you're very, very good at automating the drilling structures and creating autonomous drilling structures onshore. I mean, for me, then you start going and saying, well, space mining sounds very, very interesting after that. And so, like, if I look at this, say maybe 30 to 40 years, I think a lot of the kind of the capabilities, you can start saying, well, this looks a lot like, going out and mining asteroids. Right? So for me, that sort of horizon of energy and what we can do, it'd be better if we didn't do it on Earth. It'd be better if we did it somewhere else from Earth. We're here today, and we have to do it on Earth, and we're going to go through some transitions. But there's no reason long term that we need to get all our energy requirements from this planet.
Well, that's definitely a great way to end the conversation. Please join me in thanking Sean for some very interesting ideas and challenging ones.
Please join me in thanking both Sean and Deborah for a fantastic conversation. That was great.